despite it being such a long day, this is actually our first official brain hack event. So on behalf of the organizing committee, we're going to do a proper welcome when we start the official South African Brain Hack on Wednesday. But it's really nice to actually start it unofficially in Johannesburg and to have everybody here with us that's joining online and everybody here with us physically. And so we're really grateful to have Professor Oliver Turnbull here with us. He's actually an ex-Vitsi, and I did have his actual bio, but because it's been he's going to talk about himself and his research in a bit, but I will do more of an informal introduction. I've been given the task of only 30 seconds, and I've gone over less 30 seconds. So for those of you that don't know Professor Turnbull, he's a clinical neuropsychologist and a neuroscientist, and I was actually lucky enough to meet him in London. So through my previous supervisors, Katarina at the top of the Mark Soames, that also worked closely with Oliver and through the neuropsychoanalysis meetings. And it was really exciting when I came back to South Africa to see Oliver actually in his, can I call it, home university events. And so I calculated between the conferences we've been together, I think we've been in the same 4 different countries. Oliver doesn't know this, but as a fangirl, you also can count the number of times. So 4 different countries, so it's really exciting to have you today. We're going to see a glimpse of the work that she's done. Some of the work, art included, is actually on the table today. But for those of you that haven't had the pleasure of having dinner with Oliver, he's not just an amazing neuroscientist, he's also just intimidatingly clever. So he knows a lot about many things, and so I don't know a lot about many things, and so it's difficult to kind of keep up with the dinner conversation. I try my best, but it's wonderful. You learn so many new things when you have when you have the opportunity to interact with Oliver. So I encourage everyone. I'm sorry for those of you online, you won't have this opportunity, but for those of you in person, especially our students here today, so please take the time. We do have dinner afterwards, so take the time to socialize, meet our other speakers. Some of them are going to be coming in, so that's why me and Alina have been frantically on the phone, making sure that people are getting picked up at the airport. So make sure you interact with everyone, ask lots of questions, get to know each other, of course, get to know Oliver Turnbull. So thank you so much for agreeing to be here to give this talk, and I'm hoping everything's going smoothly. Audience, I'm not sure, but we'll start the talk in 2 minutes. No, it's coming, and thank you to those joining the station with us. All right, so.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and very, very nice to see some people who I've known for a very long time in this room, which is really wonderful. Thank you all very much for coming. And some people I've just met, in the last couple of days for the first time. So good to see you all. First, a bit more about me. I'm from Wales, I'm a university, a place like I call home. I live in Poole. Not going to be one of those afternoons, is it? I'm a university here in North West Wales. I live on that island just off the coast of Anglesey. It's 140 years old this year, Bangor, as it turns out. Very pleased to be here in that historic year. As you said earlier, I'm a neuropsychologist. I have an honorary position at the North Wales Brain Injury Service, which I thoroughly enjoy doing. My interest is acquired brain injury one way or the other, and particularly about emotion, which we'll be talking a bit more about today. I also like to teach a bit about anatomy. I run an annual visceral mind summer school that teaches neuroanatomy through drawing to people who are interested in the brain and want to learn using a slightly different technique to some other approaches. And Kate, I think, has been on that course. So, in fact, I ran a local one here like nearly 10 years ago. I'm also interested in teaching anatomy not only by drawing brains, but I also started painting them about a decade or so ago. So our Visceral Mind book has, let's find the picture. Here. There's a nice colourful one. So there we go. The drawings that you should do, and then the equivalent painting on the other side. So it's a bit of a chance for you to see what my stuff looks like. When I was the head of the department, I managed to get us to do a brain sculpture. Build a brain sculpture, just quite fun. So I'm not completely obsessed with brains, more or less. Okay, I'm going to talk about emotion, but no one in my position does this sort of work, on their own. So I just want to thank a few of my usual colleagues. Christian Salas, who I'll say in a few minutes, Leanne. Christian was my PhD student a decade ago, Leanne, just maybe 5 years or so ago, and really Chris, who I've been a long time collaborator with. I'll say a bit more about him later. And some other colleagues, including Mark Summons, who I've been collaborating with since the 1980s. Don't say that too loud. I'm not that old. Okay, so I'd like to talk firstly about the big problem that emotion has faced in the last more than 100 years, and then talk about some of the solutions. And this slide carries a lot of those big problems. We live in this absolutely appalling, we're okay back there, Safa? Is everything all right?
Yeah.
Okay. We've lived through a very difficult century in which emotion was neglected in the strongest sense of the word by our field, which is really terrible. My list for worst quotes of the century by a psychologist is this P.F. Skinner quote: "Emotions are excellent examples of the fictional causes to which we commonly attribute behavior." If that's true, there really is no such thing as mental illness. Your friend who's depressed or someone who's anxious are just pretending, I suppose. We're all robots, automata. Our entire legal system runs completely counter to this classic quote. And unfortunately, psychology has gradually moved away from that position. I use the word gradually because it's still a very minority sport in our field. Here's a little survey we did in 2016 of textbooks to try to show how much space is dedicated to emotion versus cognition. And in this particular case, which is the Ramachandran Encyclopedia, emotion gets 2% of the book and cognition gets 38%. That's a pretty strong asymmetry, given that most human beings seem to think that emotion is really incredibly important. So why are we spending so little research time on something that's absolutely vital to the experience of being human? So here's what I'd like to do today. I'm not often in Johannesburg, so I thought I would try to do a stop tour of the big picture. I could spend an hour on any one of these. You spend 5 or 10 minutes on each of them, and then give you a feel for the overall work. There are lots of other papers that lie behind these. I will try to get a few printed out so you can come and have a look afterwards if you're interested. So I'll speak for a few minutes for people who are new to the world of emotion, about the brain basis of the experience of emotion, which I think we need to sort of set the seeds. Then I'll talk about some of our work on emotion regulation, talk about amnesia and the role that emotion may or may not play in amnesia, including the role in the psychotherapies. And then I'll talk about emotion and delusional beliefs, which turned out to be incredibly important, although we had to quite hard for that position. And finally, I'll say a little bit about emotion and neurorehabilitation. It's something we've been trying to push very hard in my little brain injury service. So 5 topics, 5 or 10 minutes on each, and I'll take questions afterwards if you have any. So let's talk about emotional experience first. Powerful emotions are ancient in evolutionary terms, even though, of course, not everyone seems to necessarily feel this way. So let's start by saying how the field has changed across my lifespan. If I'd been giving this talk in the 1970s, I would not only have been a lot younger, but I would have given a different talk, because the field was then dominated by the role of the cerebral cortex and by hemispheric asymmetry. So lots of evidence to suggest that the right cerebral hemisphere is more important for example, recognizing emotions in faces or recognizing emotion in voices. And that literature is simultaneously absolutely true and wrong. It's true in the sense that the data remains valid as they always were. There is a huge right hemisphere advantage, at least in people with conventional cerebral dominance, for example, recognizing. That was interesting. So while this is up here, there's no reason why I can't talk. So why is it wrong? So first, the data are really correct. It really is a right hemisphere advantage, at least in people with conventional cerebral dominance. The problem is that it's not motivational. So the reason why the cerebral hemisphere is important for emotion recognition is because it's a complex cognitive task. Telling the difference between a happy and a sad face is really complex visual spatial arithmetic. They all look the same faces, and they're just a minor question of the location of some muscle groups and your eye rings and so on that allow you to tell the difference. You need powerful intellectual horsepower to solve that problem, and the cerebral cortex will do that job for you. Similarly, for the detection of emotion and speech prosody, it's a complex auditory task. But just saying that something is involved in the cognitive aspects of emotion is a very different matter from discussing the question of whether it's motivational, visceral, very powerful, and it does look at the question of whether the cerebral cortex is involved in that. And if I could see the next slide, can we move to the next slide? Yeah.
You try with it?
We could try. There we go. Okay. So there are several papers I can put up here, but I'll show one that we published nearly a decade ago now. This it gives us a feeling for symptom severity. We did a data collection on a group of complicated grief. So these are people, the two arrow bars, the two bars over here are either, well, they're all people who've been bereaved. Half of the participants have had a relatively normal period of mourning, and they're still unhappy about the fact that they've lost their loved one, but they're not depressed about it. And the second group have complicated grief. It's more or less a DSM category now. They're still overwhelmed by that grief. And if you measure symptom severity, that is how sad, how anxious, and so on, you feel, they show about double the amount of symptom severity to the control group. And remember, the control group are also bereaved. So clearly, if you want to measure the feeling of these things, there are some very, very important differences. So what happens down the bottom if you test, for example, emotion recognition? And the answer, there is no slide because it wasn't interesting enough to get into the journal. No differences on any category. So these are not cognitive effects. These are effects that are powerfully related to the way that human beings feel. So if it isn't cortical, then where else would you go? And we've known the answer to this question probably since the middle of about the last century. So James Alter's work was the first to demonstrate it very clearly in rats. You might have learned some of those findings in sort of physiological psychology classes. He puts electrodes into different parts of the brains of rats and offers them a choice between stimulation of the brain or another thing, like, for example, food or access to a sexually receptive rat. There's a whole lot of categories, actually, in which rats powerfully choose stimulation of the brain for some brain areas, like the central nucleus, rather than. Oh, sorry. Okay. So they don't starve, they don't die of starvation, but they come very close. They lose a huge amount of weight, and after they've been pressing the bar for 5 or 6 hours, they think, okay, I'm going to have a nibble of some food, but now back to the good stuff. I need to push some more. They choose to serve sexually receptive mates, they cross electric grids. In female rats, they neglect their pups. It's just everything bad about the world in order for them to stimulate these brain areas, which just look very powerfully reinforcing, a bit like the drugs of addiction. So, in case you don't believe it, only in rats, I'll give you a couple of other examples. In one of the less ethical experiments, if you want to read the paper, don't do it if you're of a gentle disposition. Work on this was carried out in the 1970s. Stimulation of the central nucleus, which produces really powerful effects for human participants. So great feelings of pleasure, alertness, and warmth. And it's a tragic tale to read, actually, in the paper. They say, well, it's the end of the session now, Mr. Jones, just going to unplug you. And he says, no, just give me a few more minutes, I just want a bit more of it, please don't take it away. Really, really powerfully effective. If there's somebody on there who could be muting.
It's just the feedback. Okay.
You really should. Okay.
We're testing your executive functions.
So that's one category of example that is showing that basically the same work. Similar, although not identical work, is carried out by Helen Mayberg for the treatment of otherwise intractable depression. So you can't get into Helen's study unless you have 4 separate treatment modality failures. So that drugs don't work, and ECT doesn't work, and psychotherapy doesn't work, and eventually you're at the end of the road. And finally you get referred to Helen, where you have stimulation, deep brain stimulation of the subgenual cingulate, just underneath the corpus callosum over here. And the effects happen within seconds of inducing that electrical current. Here are some photos. The blanket over me got lighter. It was disappearing into the void. I was thinking happy thoughts. One of the accounts were from the paper. There's a woman who said, "Oh, I can't wait to get home. My house is such a mess. I've done nothing at home. It's a catastrophe, and I really want to tidy things up and get back to my life." So, really powerful effect suggesting that subcortical brain areas, these ancient subcortical areas, are a part of the experience of emotion, rather than just the clever cognitive stuff, which of course several cortex can do. We've also published a fair few papers over the years demonstrating that cortical lesions don't disrupt the experience of basic emotion. That's not to say that they're unchanged in their emotional lives, as we'll see in a few minutes, but the experience of basic emotions remains the same for all categories. Here's an imaging study of Tony Damasio showing more or less the same thing. It's a subtraction technique. So we'll focus on sadness, which turns out to be the most powerful of basic emotions for us here. You can see left and right cerebral hemispheres show no significant difference, and also the big effects and the subtraction are in brainstem. Always the cerebellum, of course, in our world, but brainstem towards the hypothalamus and forwards, in this case, to the anterior cingulate. The cortex is unchanged, or in those purple areas shows deactivation. These people are not thinking, by the way, they're meant to think in this case really sad thoughts, like, I've been dumped, she's left me again, my life will never be the same, whatever sad thoughts they are. These people are planning, they're shopping for tomorrow. They're just cycling through, ruminating over particular dark thoughts. So the evidence for the subcortical basis of emotion is really strong. We also did some work, that's Christian Salas over there, trying to better measure the phenomenon. A lot of the early stuff for the elicitation of emotion wanted experimental control. So, for example, they would show the same film clips to different people, or show the same pictures of things. The problem with that, of course, is firstly, people are different. So if I've got a spider phobia, then showing me a picture of a spider is not going to be the same as somebody else. And secondly, they might not be especially powerful because you've got some ethical control over what you can show people in those images. So we pioneered a task called affective story recall, which is individualized. So I say to you, tell me a story about something in your life that made you very sad. And you get, as you can see over here, more powerful effects that way because it's your sad thing, not somebody else's. And we can do that in a way that doesn't lose the specificity of the emotion. So the difference, this is comparing pictures versus personal stories. And the specificity of the emotion that's elicited is more or less identical. So here's my summary. I think that the field agrees, although if you really want me to, I can tell you some people who don't, but they're in the minority. That we have probably a small number of emotions. The jury's out on the exact number. My field fight about whether it's 4, 5, 6, or 7. We don't have an hour here to discuss that interesting debate. And it's unquestionably mediated by a range of subcortical structures running from upper brainstem forwards. Again, if we had more time, we can talk about which of them is more powerful. They're not all equally important, but we know, but they will seem to be one or the other. And these are the motivational bits, not the clever bits. They're simple. And indeed, they are old, and therefore you get a number of very important effects here. For example, they're common across cultures. We've published some papers demonstrating powerful conservation of categories of emotion, for example, by sex differences across human cultures. 15, I think, with the sample size of several thousand in our paper. And we think it's true across historical time, which of course is why the plays of William Shakespeare or the ancient Greeks are still powerfully motivational for us now. We think that these effects are true, even those intellectual capabilities are very limited. For example, small children who are lovely but aren't terribly bright. People in the later stages of dementia, for example, found with disabilities are still, if you ponder with a pointy stick, are still not made very happy by those experiences. And finally, we think this is true of all. Well, let me choose my words carefully. Definitely true of all mammals, and I think there's a reasonable case for all vertebrate species, which is an incredibly powerful statement to make. The narrow claim would be mammals, and I think that's really clear. So that's the experience of emotion. I think the battle is not won yet, but I think we've moved a huge distance in the last couple of decades. Okay, So let's talk about something completely different, not the experience of emotion, but our ability to manage those feelings. It's another matter. When we talk about understudied, this is a little graph that takes you to 2012 of citations of the word emotion regulation in the literature, and it goes from a close approximation of 0 to something that looks like it's about to head off exponentially. It has been reported about over the years, but it was really heavily understudied. We published in when was this, 2019. The literature seemed to be publishing about 1.5 pages per year on this topic, on the brain basis of emotion regulation. It really is ridiculous, considering how powerfully important this is. Emotion regulation is, I was going to say the number one, maybe not exaggerate, a powerful predictor of psychopathology and outcome in psychotherapy. People who can't manage their feelings are in all sorts of problems. So we've tried to move that field on. We've got a review paper here with James Rose, who's the guru of emotion regulation, and trying to show you here. So I don't want to show you all of the work, but I'll give you 2 examples, just to give you a feeling for the work that we do in human lesion neuropsychology, and also the fact that we can focus on particular categories of emotion regulation. So I'm going to show you 2 types. The first of them is response modulation. That's the ability to dial an emotion up or down. It's really important socially. For example, you want to avoid schadenfreude, smiling when your friends have something bad happen to them. On the other hand, it's really good for when you're having a bit of a bad day. You can do something that cheers other people up, and then we're all cheered up. So asking people to amplify or inhibit their emotions while we videotape and then we analyze facial expressions is really interesting. Then the question becomes, if you study enough patients with cortical lesions, what's the lesion overlap? Here's the finding, and the answer is that response modulation is right lateralized and involves more or less inferior frontal cortex and especially anterior insula, which is interesting and useful for us to know. So, and the effect is pretty powerful. It's driven by a small number of people who have both of those lesions, really quite substantial anterior insula and inferior frontal lesions. So that's a right lateralized category. Notably, of course, there's no language involved in this process. So let's try it again, this time with added language. And here we have a left-sided lesion, which is producing the disorder, and the task is reappraising. So something bad happens to you, and you have to reframe it in a more positive way. You can see the really important use of this skill when we ask people in the lab to choose examples, like for example, you've just been dumped. Someone you think you've loved for a long time has just rejected you. So can you think about anything positive in relation to that? Well, you can. You get lots of good examples. My friends were telling me they were a lunatic. At last, I'm finally free. Or, oh, do you know what? My childhood best friend has just spoken to me on Facebook, and maybe we could get back together. There are ways of reframing rejection more positively, and that's what these patients with left frontal lesions don't seem able to do. In fact, we have enough of a sample that we could see which tasks of executive function correlated with that skill, and it turns out to be inhibition and verbal fluency. So if I can try to explain to you what I think is happening here, it is you could try to inhibit your sadness if you've just been dumped, but it's hard to do that all day. It's exhausting. But imagine if you could temporarily inhibit your sadness, and then you could put like a cognitive sticking plaster or a bandage over it. And that's what the reframing is. So I try not to be too depressed for a few seconds, and then I think, oh, my friends have been telling me I was going out with a lunatic, and thank heavens, I will have nothing more to do with them again. I'm saved. You now no longer have to practice inhibition then, because you've just built yourself a little cognitive tool which will protect you permanently from that feeling of rejection. And people who don't have that, who don't have either or especially both of inhibition and verbal fluency, seem to do very badly. So I'll give you another example of that. This is from a patient seen in psychotherapy who was actually ex-academic, so he's very, very delicately chose the really charming phrase sticky sadness to describe this phenomenon. I think many clinicians would call it rumination. So he feels sad some of the time, but he can't stop himself from being sad. So he has his from the lesion site, he has some difficulties walking, And this makes him feel sad. He says, I know it's okay to feel sad, but this isn't like normal sadness. It's a sticky sadness, which makes me feel sad that I should. And then he describes how it's like getting your foot stuck in the mud. You can't get yourself out of this of the situation because he lacks the executive abilities that you could use to turn that around. And I haven't showed you in the next slide, but he then also says that his wife can solve that problem for him. So she is an external pair of frontal lobes that can do the reframing work, of the reappraisal work of setting his mood back on the straight track. So that's the second thing I want to say. Emotion regulation. The experience of emotion is powerful and very ancient and really subcortical, but the phenomenon of managing our feelings is a much more recent thing. It's a real human skill. You can't put this many primate species, apart from humans, in a room like this for an hour listening to someone like me and not have them start fighting with each other. But hopefully, big fights won't break out today because that's our great skill, is cooperating at scale because we're better than other primate species at managing our feelings because we've got bigger frontal lobes than other primate species. But it's important to distinguish between those things. Is that a question about?
Sorry, I was thinking that you finished again. I do have I don't want to derail the talk, but I do have a question.
Let's try.
So I'm just curious about kind of how much effort plays into this behavior, kind of controlling it, particularly because like rumination seems to, it feels like you're solving a problem while you do it.
The problem doesn't get solved.
Exactly. Like if I think about this long enough now, I can figure out why I can't. And it never happens, obviously. But it feels like that's occupying the same kind of cognition as also overriding the behavior. It's like the same kind of making sense and planning behavior that also makes it feel very difficult to do that.
Yeah, I think that they would like to get out of the cycle, at least in abstract terms, but as we'll see in 10 minutes' time, powerful emotions are really hard to stop. We try to design our lives so that we can have not too much very powerful emotion, because when it really happens to you, it's really terrifying or really depressing, and we have entire systems of how to manage the world. So I think it's a good question, and we should stick with it. I've got another question there.
I'm sure it's like a silly question.
It's
that
the best
very
ones.
much like silly sadness? Would you be able to say that is like stronger or that emotion is stronger in individuals with pre-existing internalizing disorders?
Well, I'm not sure if this answers your question, but there does seem something about sadness as an emotion which seems especially powerful for humans. Actually, it's probably especially powerful for mammals. Probably it's because of a big decision we made as mammals a long time ago that we were going to give birth to infants who were going to be helpless. So we needed primary caregivers, let's not over stereotype it, to be attached, powerfully attached. The problem, of course, is that, what's that famous quote? And depression is the price we pay for love. So, if evolution is going to make primary caregivers, let's say, very attached to children, it also makes them more vulnerable to depression and other things, which probably explains some of the gender asymmetries we see, but of course it's not unique to human beings, but it is probably more of a mammal thing. So about 10 minutes ago, go back too fast, there. So there's the imaging findings for these basic emotions, and if you just sort of measure the amount of red on the screen for each of those, you'll see that unfortunately sadness is winning. So, and there's quite a literature, even in cognitive psychology, suggesting that loss is overvalued by humans. We feel it especially strongly, probably for those evolutionary reasons that we talked about. Okay, now I need to get back to where I was. Okay, so that's my second point, is that emotion regulation is a cortical thing. So the next thing that I think we need to be interested in, or we could be interested in, is how this stands in relation to memory. And particularly the fact that we know in the last 50 years of my field research have shown that human beings run multiple memory systems simultaneously. One of which, much understudied, is related to emotion. Emotion-based learning is the term we tended to use for what I've heard it described as intuition or hunches or gut feelings. And I'll say more about that in delusional beliefs in 10 minutes' time. But I was particularly interested in this in relation to the psychotherapist. So let's talk a bit about the fact that we can store more than one memory system at once. Here's a classic finding from Edouard Claparede, more than a century ago. He did another experiment that you couldn't get ethics approval for these days, in which he was seeing on his daily ward rounds a patient who was profoundly amnesic. He then, so of course she never remembered him, he then smuggles into his hand a pin, shakes her hand, with ethics, dilemma comes in, and of course she impales herself on the pin. We're not here to talk about ethics, though the question is, what happens the next day? So he reaches out his hand to shake her hand the next day, and she wants to know nothing about this. Even though, of course, she doesn't remember who he is. I think the paper describes her response, which is sort of things you would say 100 years ago, as surely a woman has the right not to shake a gentleman's hand. She knows there's something wrong about him, but she doesn't understand why. So it's, we would say, an example of preserved emotion-based learning, but with a loss, Tony Tomasi did the same experiment 100 years later, but with more experimental control. And the answer probably has something to do with the big anatomical differences between these systems. So the famous structures that underpin episodic memory are the medial temporal lobes, and of course some other structures towards the midline of the brain of the phonics. And loss of those brain structures produces the classic amnesia that we see in lots of films, or of course we see in early Alzheimer's disease. But emotion-based learning systems are run completely differently. There's nothing about the medial temporal lobes here. These are structures that run forwards towards, from our brainstem towards the medial part of the frontal lobes. So it looks like amnesic patients are losing this system, but keeping that system entirely intact. So we published a couple of papers trying to demonstrate that dissociation, which was of some interest, including, by the way, in Alzheimer's disease, which has very interesting implications, particularly, by the way, for the care of the elderly. There's often reported cases of carers who behave poorly towards people who've got dementia because, of course, they can't remember. And it's right, they can't remember using one of these systems, but the other system is working perfectly fine, thank you very much. So I think it has implications, I think, for lots of aspects of our society. Here's about patients' performance. I find it quite interesting just to meet these patients. The first time you meet an amnesic patient, or at least the ones we met, they're always questioning you every 5 minutes. Who are you? Why are you here? A phenomenon which goes away after the first session or two because you're somehow familiar to them, even though, of course, they can't remember your name. And it made us think, oh, so here are the data, by the way, this is an emotion-based learning task. And here, SL's performance is indistinguishable from controls, even though it's arguably a memory task. I can talk to you later about what that memory task is, but the important thing is preserved emotion-based learning. It also made me wonder about this question of transfer psychotherapies. So I managed to convince a colleague and good friend of mine to do something absolutely bonkers, which is to see patients who are profoundly amnesic in psychotherapy. Paul's seen 2 of them now. I think in one case for about 18 months, and the second for about 2 years. So if you just want to imagine what it's like seeing a patient for psychotherapy who can't remember what's happened 2 minutes ago for 2 years, it's quite interesting. I can describe the medical side of that later if you want, but the important thing is that they appear to develop a working relationship with the therapist, and there are reports from the care staff, because they're all in residential care, that many of the behavioural difficulties that they previously suffered from are much improved. There's some very interesting parts of the paper which show that the patient uses the therapist as an external memory aid, because of course they can't remember what happened. So they sort of outsource the problem to their therapist. If you want to read the paper, at least one of them, there's some quite intriguing parts about the end of the therapeutic process. So if you can imagine, when you've been seeing someone in therapy for 2 years, then when you realise that it's the third last session and the second last session and the last session, then both of you in the room know that this is ending, and so you can try to end the relationship. But imagine if you didn't know. So, and of course, it creates huge problems for the therapist, because what do you say? Do you want it every 3 minutes He's saying, by the way, I'm not going to see you again for the rest of your life. Intriguingly, although we don't have enough data to say too clearly, lots of themes of separation and loss come up indirectly in those later therapies, as if the patient kind of knows that we're heading towards loss, even though, of course, they can't remember episodic. Okay, so that's my third point, which is that probably we don't need episodic memory in order to do reasonable psychotherapy, which has implications because there are lots of neurological patients who are denied access to therapy on the grounds that their brains are somehow incomplete. It's a bit of a hobby of mine, and I'll say more about that later. Okay, so because of that excellent question from Devin at the back of the room earlier, he's primed us to this question about emotions and seeing the world properly. Let's remember that accurately understanding the world is a developmental achievement. All of us, well, I'll speak for myself, I won't ever generalize the room here, but you might want to think that you are more charming, more intelligent, better looking than reality might suggest. And being a grown-up is all about realizing that you are who you are and seeing yourself properly. Although, for example, some US presidential candidates don't seem to have it. But normally it's a strong representational developmental achievement. So the question here is, what happens in the balance of power between emotions and delusional beliefs if emotions start to get the upper hand? That is, if there's an impairment of emotion regulation, so that the patient is faced with a choice between something which is not true but has a positive emotional outcome versus something which is true but has a negative emotional outcome. That's the truth of the fact that we're not as clever, intelligent, or charming, or whatever as we might wish to be. Can you face up to that fact or not? And this is a group of patients who have damaged emotion regulation systems, that is, frontally managed emotion regulation systems, to see. You should
not include pictures of the patients then.
That's a joke. That was a joke for renting. That was an ethics violation. Okay, so there are a couple of examples of patients here demonstrating that in people with emotion regulation issues and delusional beliefs, that the delusional beliefs are powerfully positively biased. So they live in a world that is more positive than reality suggests, especially, for example, compared with controls. And I'm going to show you an example which I think demonstrates that quite clearly. So these are a group of confabulated patients versus normal amnesics versus healthy controls. There we go. So I've got a story for you, which you're going to have to try to remember. And I'll show you three groups of people trying to work their way through that problem. So this is the story that the patients get. You're a hard-working employee, it's Sunday morning and you're ready to go out. You're planning a wonderful trip to the seaside in order to rest. However, your best friend calls you saying they're ill and lonely and need your help. Feeling exhausted and unable to bear missing your trip, you lie to them. Drum roll. Yeah. Saying that you promised to see a family member. 4 days later, you find out that due to inappropriate treatment as a spell, your friend's health has severely deteriorated. You feel guilty and ashamed of yourself. So try to store that information in there so we can compare the performance of three different groups of people. I'm not expecting excellent performance here from us as a group, but there are two things I'd like us to look out for. The first of them is content. How much of the 20 odd items that are in here are you able to remember? Nobody's perfect, but let's see how people do. And then secondly, I'm interested in the emotional tone, because this bad stuff is happening here. You're lying to a friend of yours, and then something bad happens to the friend, and you feel guilty and ashamed, which is not an unreasonable emotional outcome, considering your rather inappropriate behavior. So, do we try a couple of groups of people? Let's try someone neurologically normal first, the control participants. So, I'm a dedicated employee. I'm sitting on a Sunday morning looking forward to a day trip on the seaside. My friend calls me telling me they're feeling ill and lonely. But it wasn't in the original version, but in many respects. I explain, no, actually, I don't explain how tired I am. I make up an excuse that I have to see my family, which is correct. And then 4 days later, my friend's health has deteriorated due to inappropriate treatment. That was a good recall of that content. And I feel guilty, and I can't remember what else it is. So, content, I don't know, 60% or so of the material, which is not bad. It's probably about the same as you would get in this room. And you see the emotional tone of the response. That is this feeling of guilt because of the misleading or framing of bad outcome. Okay? So we've published some work demonstrating more or less this sort of thing across multiple trials. And this includes the question of the preservation of emotional learning in people who are amnesic. And I'll demonstrate that now with the same story. So this is I think I went forward 2 slides. Well, unless I've lost the slide. Well, no, I haven't lost the slide. It's just that amnesic just hadn't produced very much content. I lost it at the top. So here's an amnesic patient. They're not a confabulator, but of course they've got a strong memory impairment. And by the way, I can't find amnesics who remember nothing. So here's the performance on this paper that we published of controls across multiple recollections. People get up to about 60% or so with repetitions. And here are amnesic patients. These patients have got corticals. I mean, they're amnesic, but I just can't get anyone to 0. So whether 5 or 10. And here's the content. He made an excuse that he was on holiday and his friend died. Oh yes, and I felt ashamed. So let's talk about content. There's not very much of it. It's not completely wrong. There's an excuse in there, and it's not really a holiday. And unfortunately, the friend didn't die, but bad things happened. And then what about the emotional tone? Spot on. That's 100% performance. And over here, we can see the recollection of people who are amnesic. One of these, it's hard to tell because that's the control participants of the story across these 5 trials. We switched, by the way, in the middle to refresh things. And that's the performance in emotional terms of the amnesic Korsakoff group. There's no difference between them. The emotional tone of our Korsakoff patients remains preserved in their recollection, even though their memory performance is catastrophic relative to the controls. So clearly, there's something about these amnesic patients that allows them to remember, not remember content, but get emotional tone right, which is consistent with the anatomy we had earlier. But the drum roll is, of course, I need a confabulator. Okay, so should we try? You all know the part which I think people will love. You're going to see your sister on the coast. You felt you needed a rehab visit to get yourself totted up again. Your friend rings, he feels ill, getting worse, you need a bit of help. Would you like to go and talk to him, to cheer him up, put him straight, whatever? You go down, you do that. That was on a Monday, or something like that. By the Friday, the medical people realized that they'd been giving him the wrong treatment. And his condition has deteriorated considerably. But you feel happy that you've been down to help on time. How about that? Much better content than our amnesic patients. There's just one tiny little mistake in the recollection, which is that the world seems much rosier from the perspective of this confabulator. And here's the graph that I find most powerful, which is that the Korsakoff's, the amnesic patients and the confabulators and the controls are more or less the same on basically every task, including, by the way, things which are incorrect but are positive about you. They're very happy to hear good news, the confabulators. It's just one category, which is that when there's a bad story about themselves, strangely enough, the whole tone of things change. And it reminds me, if I can return to the question of US presidential candidates, there are some people who just seem to not want to hear bad news. No matter which material you give to them, there's always a reframing in such a way that they are the cleverest person in the room, more knowledgeable than all of the experts. I'm sure you must be. So, okay. So that's that. If we're doing it for time, we're running a bit late because we had a few intrusions, but
I just wanted to ask, with that sort of thing, it's bringing to mind cognitive dissonance and also like a failing of accurate perception of reality, which is bringing to mind like a predictive coding element. And I wonder what you think about those.
Yeah.
I mean, the weightings of those.
I think it's a really important phenomenon which you can describe in a number of different ways. This is a nice old task for it, you know, the coding literature. I could imagine a world in which we could talk about as a defense, which is that these delusional beliefs are protecting you against you know, unpleasant things. And like many defenses, they're ineffective, except temporarily, of course. So there are lots of ways of describing it. And by the way, what I would like to say, which I want to go back to here, I'm not claiming, by the way, we are not claiming that it's that emotion is the only explanatory aspect of confabulation. We know, by the way, that it's a correlate also of executive function. So you know, these people are not, and we know, by the way, confabulators, as their executive function improves, so their confabulation tends to get a bit better. But emotion is clearly a variable in there, and of course, as we all know, emotion is a very important delusional piece, as the example I suggested earlier. Okay, so I want to finish by saying a little bit about emotion in rehabilitation. It was based on this sort of line of research was based on some thinking. First, remember I started out by saying that our field has become so cognitive heavy. Emotion is just not a thing, and therefore neurorehabilitation has been very cognitively heavy. People are trying to get people to practice executive function which they've lost in order to try to make things better. But actually, the principal complaints of patients, and especially their families, are not about cognitive impairments. They're about emotion-related things. That my husband gets angry in the way that he used to, or I'm too afraid to go to the shops now, you know, now that I've had my brain injury. So we tried to devise a neuro rehab program which is more emotion regulation focused, to try to get to the sort of heart of the problem. And I'll show you a little bit of those data. I suppose I just said this earlier, that our patients' complaints are emotion-based. So in Northwest, we try and run what we call a low-intensity, long-term community rehab program. Too many patients with acquired brain injury report that they receive quite intensive interventions immediately after their brain injury, and then they're cast to the four winds for the rest of their lives, and they feel neglected. So we try to design something where we don't put all our efforts in that immediate post-traumatic period, and instead we offer them basically lifelong care. So we don't have a lot that we can offer, but when you have a problem, come and see us and we'll do what we can. We also have like medical services everywhere. We have a problem of money, which is why we started to work on groups. Sorry, so some of this is in this book here, Stated Neuropsychology with Christian and my patient Christian and Rudy and my patient Rudy. And there are some good stories in the book I'll tell you about later. They're basically all the sex stories of all the errors that we made in the training. But made neutral so that no one can sue us. Okay, so this is Leanne Rowlands. This was her PhD. She did an emotion-focused, designed and then implemented an emotion-focused rehab system. We tried to have groups between 5 and 10. 10 is too big. 5, there isn't enough continuity to the groups. We also had, we measured two things. Firstly, the traditional cognitive alliance, which is the classic measure that people use in the psychotherapies. And we got very modest scores on the therapeutic alliance. So it's nice to have a therapist with good alliance, but it's not a killer. Actually, the outcome comes from this variable called group cohesion. So our big idea was that if we were trying to deliver lifelong care, then we need to create little groups of people who can be support for each other. And we leave after 7 or 8 sessions. But you know, they've all got their WhatsApp details. In fact, our intervention starts in their first week with them sharing their details because they have to plan their graduation ceremony that happens in the last session. So in order to do that, they have to work out who's in charge of what and who's going to go to the shops to buy this, and you know, and so on, gets them to work together. And we published quite a few papers demonstrating that they really seem to appreciate this. there's a line that ran through one of our qualitative studies saying we're all in the same boat, that is only someone with a brain injury can properly understand what it's like to have a brain injury. It's dual, but our patients felt it very powerfully. They really enjoyed those groups. And the better the groups worked, the more the patients seemed to have good outcomes, which is very good for us. I got on a hobby horse about 10 minutes ago in relation to cognitive impairment. There is a literature out there which suggests that if you have some other form of cognitive impairment, then it's a big barrier to any forms of psychotherapy, including memory impairment, by the way. I just don't think it's true. Data suggests that cognitive impairment of one sort or another doesn't seem to be too much of a problem, with the exception of course, powerful disassociative impairment, which can be difficult. And also concrete thinking. So there are 2 chapters in the book. One of them called Concrete Patients Need Concrete Therapists, about the extent to which many of the traditional psychotherapies are set up for abstract thinking and people to ruminate on large, long-term issues, which our disassociative patients don't get. They're looking for practical solutions to everyday needs. There's a chapter in the book called Thinking Inside the Box, partly because it's titled in a box, which is another story, but also because thinking outside the box is all about these grand ideas. Our patients don't need grand ideas. They need simple things that will work time and time again in order to help them solve difficulties. And I'll talk about what those are in a few minutes if you want. So, here are my conclusions. Emotion has been badly neglected. On the plus side, the low point was the middle of the last century. So we're on the up, and the FCO is long dead. So we really have seen change, but we're way not there yet, because the majority of work in our field is cognitively biased. Then, despite that, emotion has really powerful effects across a range of well-known cognitive phenomena, but they're often not seen through an emotional lens. So emotion and memory, emotion and decision-making, emotion and delusional beliefs, managing emotion, they're cognitive phenomena, and we need to think about them from the perspective of emotion if we have a choice. And of course, these have really powerful implications, not just for neuroscience and neuropsychology, but for related disciplines. So clearly, psychotherapy and the whole range of phenomena related to mental health, there are implications here. And of course, we have a much better chance of a proper neuroscience of psychotherapy. I have some strong opinions about the sorts of research that's carried out in the field and why our approach has some advantages that others don't. So on that basis, I think our field has really changed across my career. It's been a delight to be part of it. And I look forward to an even more impressive future. On that front, I think I'm stopping. Thank you very much.